What better way to celebrate Halloween than with a walk through two of New York City's most historic graveyards, St. Paul's Chapel and Trinity Church, both located in Lower Manhattan or the Financial District. Now, I'm going to admit here that these are not the oldest graveyards in New York City or in New York State, and in the future I will be visiting some of those graveyards for you in Staten Island and Long Island, but for today we are going to talk about Trinity and St. Paul's. We'll start our tour with historic St. Paul's Chapel graveyard. St. Paul's was built in 1766, and it's really a younger church site than Trinity Church, but all of the A-listers that I know you want to hear about are at Trinity Church. So just to add a little suspense to our tour, I'm going to start at St. Paul's Chapel. Besides, there are people buried at St. Paul's Chapel you have never heard of who are just as important in the American Revolution as the people in Trinity Graveyard. So let's get started. You can find St. Paul's Chapel on Broadway between Vesey and Fulton Streets in Lower Manhattan, just a little bit south of where our City Hall is, and north of Wall Street, where the New York Stock Exchange is. St. Paul's Chapel seems like it faces Broadway, since Broadway is the main thoroughfare in that part of the city, but the Broadway side is really the back of the church. But everyone thinks of it as the front, so we'll start here at the front of St. Paul's Chapel, with the monument dedicated to Major General Richard Montgomery. Richard Montgomery was a young general. He was 37 years old. He was commanding New York regiments at the Battle of Quebec in 1775 in December, when he was, I think, the first person killed in that battle, and he was killed by artillery fire. After the American Revolution, the monument you see here was commissioned by the Congress. It was made in Paris, shipped here to New York, and installed in the Palladia window you see here. Now, in order to accommodate the Montgomery Monument, a new altarpiece was made as well, and you can see a little bit of that through the windows. That altarpiece was done by another Revolutionary War soldier. His name was Pierre L'Enfant. He was a French soldier that served in the American Revolution, and he stayed in America after the Revolutionary War and became a noted architect. He created the first ever design for the city of Washington, D.C. Beneath the monument, Major General Montgomery's remains are interred there. So this is the final resting place of Major General Richard Montgomery, 37 years old, killed in the Battle of Quebec, December 1775. We're going to step down from the porch and go around to the right side of St. Paul's Chapel, or the north side. And one of the first graves we're going to run into is the grave of Captain William Talbot. And you can see it's marked here with a little Revolutionary War marker on it and a little flag. Captain Talbot is one of New York's young men who opted to fight for King George III. When we look at the entry for his grave, we see that it says he fought in the 17th Light Dragoons. Now, the 17th Light Dragoons was a British unit, and so Captain Talbot much more likely fought in what were called Tarleton's Raiders, or under Bannister Tarleton. Tarleton commanded an American unit of royalists, so those are Americans who fought with the British in the Revolutionary War. The 17th Light Dragoons also fought at times under Bannister Tarleton's command. Now, most of you probably have never heard of Colonel Bannister Tarleton, but if you saw the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson, you saw him portrayed by Jason Isaacs as a commander named Tavington. And Tavington was really a lot worse than Tarleton was, although Tarleton was a pretty bad guy. He was portrayed much worse in the movie The Patriot than he was in real life. So this is Captain William Talbot, who died during the Revolutionary War and was buried here in his family plot at St. Paul's Graveyard. Now let's continue walking along the north side of St. Paul's Chapel, and we'll pass the true front entrance of the church, which it seems to us faces the back, but this would have been the preferred direction from which to enter the church at the time it was built in 1766. Now, one of the first things we see are two graves in front of a large tree, and these are the graves of Major Job Sumner and Major John Lucas. Both served as officers in the Revolutionary War, and both were officials in the Society of the Cincinnati, and Major Lucas was the treasurer of that organization. The Society of the Cincinnati are the officers that served with George Washington during the Revolutionary War, and they were two of the four original members. Now, what's interesting about both of these soldiers is that they both survived the Revolutionary War, but in 1789, we're traveling together on a ship. They both contracted yellow fever and both died of yellow fever as a result. So they survived the Revolutionary War only to die of yellow fever. Major John Lucas and Major Job Sumner, both majors, officers in the Revolutionary War, and original members of the Society of the Cincinnati. As we continue our walk through the graveyard, as we walk toward the back or toward the World Trade Center, we can stop for a moment to bask in the beautiful view of seeing some of New York's oldest right next to New York's newest. So we have here these lovely old gravestones right in front of the Oculus, the part of the World Trade Center that serves as a new train station. And this is a really nice spot to stand and just look at these right next to each other. So let's continue to the very back of the graveyard, where we come to a grave of someone that no one really cared about for about 200 years until the Hamilton musical became popular. And then so many people came to the church asking the security staff where they could find the grave that they eventually placed a brand new marker on the grave. Now, I'm not sure if you can see the marker very well from this picture I took, as I had to take it from out on the sidewalk. The graveyards are, by the way, still closed to the public, but I think this is a pretty good picture of the grave itself. It stands next to a large tree. It's an old limestone grave, long ago worn away, and it is the grave of George Eaker. George Eaker is the man who shot and killed Alexander Hamilton's firstborn son Philip in a duel in 1801. George Eaker was a young lawyer in New York. He'd given a July 4th speech that young Hamilton felt was offensive to his father, and as a result he challenged Mr. Eaker to a duel. And in the course of that duel, Philip Hamilton was shot and died the next day in his father's arms. So George Eaker, without even meaning to, changed the trajectory of Hamilton's life and really took the most important thing, probably next to his wife, away from him, his firstborn son, as that was an incredibly important thing to a man of that time. George Eaker died 3 years later in 1804 of what they called consumption, or we would call tuberculosis, and that is the same year that Hamilton died in the duel with Burr. So this is the grave of George Eaker. A short time ago, I talked about the architect Pierre L'Enfant having been a soldier in the Revolutionary War, a French soldier, and we find a couple more of those here in St. Paul's graveyard. The next one is on the walkway behind George Eaker, and his name is John Francis Vasher, and he was a doctor who served as a surgeon in the Revolutionary War. He also is an original member of the Society of the Cincinnati, as were officers Lucas and Sumner that we spoke about, and he is buried here in St. Paul's Chapel. So this is John Francis Vasher, a doctor from France who served as a surgeon in the Revolutionary War. Around the corner from Dr. Vasher, we find Colonel Stephen Rochefontaine, another French officer from the Revolutionary War who remained in America at the end of the war. As you can see from his gravesite, it is one of the largest graves in St. Paul's Chapel, and it is also fully engraved in French. You can also see that he has a very long French aristocratic name that he gave up when he chose to remain in America and shortened his name to Stephen Rochefontaine. When he served in the war, he was commander of the Army Corps of Engineers, placed in that position by Commander-in-Chief General George Washington, and after the war he remained in New York and became an instructor in the engineering school at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He married here in New York, and then his daughter was married here at St. Paul's Chapel. He is the highest-ranking French officer from the Revolutionary War to remain in America after the war, Colonel Stephen Rochefontaine. Let's walk back up through the graveyard toward the entrance to the church, and to the right side of the entrance, we come to the last grave we're going to talk about, at least in this virtual tour. And it's one of my favorite graves, and it's a grave you've seen if you've been on my Revolutionary War tour, and that is the grave of the great John Holt. And what was so special about John Holt? Well, he was a printer. And without the printers, of course, the Revolutionary War would have never happened. How else would word got around? Would people have got their opinions spread if not through the printers? And John Holt wasn't just any printer. He was the Liberty or Rebel or Patriot printer of New York. And he made that clear to everyone when he placed this symbol up on the masthead of his paper, "Unite or Die," drawn by his friend Benjamin Franklin. If the colonies unite, they will be as deadly as the timber rattlesnake, and if not, they will die like cut-up segments. When John Holt placed this on the top of his newspaper, he caused quite a bit of controversy around the city. Now, John Holt also printed the Declaration of Independence, the very copy that Commander George Washington had read on the Commons July 9th, 1776. And this is a picture of that very copy that I took when it was on display at the New York Historical Society. So it was really thrilling to see this original copy printed by John Holt. Holt had to flee New York City in August of 1776 when the British arrived, and he lived in the Hudson Valley in Poughkeepsie throughout the war, returned after the war, and started a new newspaper, the New York Independent Gazette, one of the finest, most honorable men of his time, incredibly brave and daring, the great printer, John Holt. Now we'll continue our tour a bit south on the Broadway at Trinity Church Graveyard. Just a short walk, a few blocks south on Broadway, we come to Trinity Church. Trinity Church and St. Paul's Chapel are part of the same parish. St. Paul's was founded by Trinity Church in 1766, but Trinity Church was founded in 1697. The church we see here is the third church built on this site. It was built in 1846, but the graveyard has some of the oldest graves in Lower Manhattan, like the ones you see in this little clump of trees dating to the 1680s. In spite of how old some of these graves are, and you can see that a bunch of the brownstone has chipped away, you can still clearly see the letters engraved and a number of these death head motifs which were popular at the time. So we'll begin our walk here on the north side of Trinity Graveyard by the Broadway. Let's start out with a signer of the Declaration of Independence. This is Mr. Francis Lewis. He was one of the 4 men who signed on behalf of New York. Francis Lewis also was a signer of the Articles of Confederation. That was the government that we had during the Revolutionary War and before the ratification of the Constitution in 1789. Francis Lewis is from New York, and if you're from New York, you might know Francis Lewis High School or Francis Lewis Boulevard, all named for Francis Lewis, one of our signers of the Declaration of Independence and the only signer to be buried here on the island of Manhattan. Right along the Broadway edge of the graveyard, you'll see a whole row of vault stones that belong to the same family. And in one of these vaults is a person who has my favorite epitaph of anyone in the graveyard. Now, it's not on the stone. You would have to look at the burial record to find it. But in the burial record, it says, "Herein lies John Morin Scott, who was a thorn in the side of this church every day he walked this earth." This is one of my favorite burial records of either of the two churches. Now, who was John Moran Scott? Well, he was a graduate of Yale College and a lawyer. He was a Son of Liberty and a brigadier general in the Continental Army. He was also part of a law firm with his two law partners, William Livingston and William Smith, Jr. And the often governor of New York, Cadwallader Colden, used to refer to this law firm as the Wicked Triumvirate. He said they'd made themselves necessary to all of the governance of this colony. They were really three brilliant young men who argued many cases for freedoms for the people of the colony of New York. Now, interestingly, both John Moran Scott and William Livingston went on to be patriots or rebels in the Revolutionary War, but William Smith Jr. remained a loyalist. So this is the final resting place of John Moran Scott, a thorn in the side of this church every day he walked this earth. Before we continue into the graveyard, let's not forget Lady Cornberry. Lady Cornberry is buried under the steeple of Trinity Church. Well, actually, she was buried under the steeple of the original Trinity Church, the first one that stood here. Lady Cornberry was the wife of Governor Cornberry, also known as Edward Hyde, the third Earl of Clarendon, or Viscount Cornbury, thus Lord Cornbury. And he was the governor of New York from 1702 to 1708. He is the person for whom Governor's Island obtained its name. Before that, it was called Naughton Island, and when he moved there and built a home there, people began calling it the Governor's Island, and so thus it's Governor's Island today. But that's not the really big reason Cornberry is remembered. Cornberry is remembered in New York history for being a governor who used to dress in women's clothes. Rumors abound from the time he was governor that he wore women's clothes to all sorts of official events, for addressing the colonial assembly, for promotions, for the troops, for reviewing the Queen's troops. The Queen was Queen Anne at that time, his cousin, and there are even portraits of him like the one you see here, wearing women's clothes. When his wife died in 1706, Lady Cornberry, her name was Catherine O'Brien, was buried under the steeple of Trinity Church, where she still rests today. Personally, I don't know if he really wore women's clothes. There are some historians who claim it was a story made up by his political rivals, which could be true, but it's a really interesting story, and many people from the time did write in letters that they saw him dressed in women's clothes and that they were completely disgusted and appalled by it. Remember, that was 300 years ago. One of my favorite graves in this entire graveyard, mostly because of the mystery surrounding it and the scandal surrounding it, is this one. And you can see the name on it is Charlotte Temple. Now, the thing about this grave is no one is really sure if someone is buried here at all, as there is no record ever of a Charlotte Temple being buried in Trinity Graveyard. Now, that's not unusual. The burial records are a little, incomplete, but some people believe that this is just a stone placed in the graveyard with no actual grave beneath it. Now, Charlotte Temple was the name of a book published in the 1790s by author Susanna Rawson, and the book was originally published in London. And it follows the story of a young girl, Charlotte Temple. I think she's 16 in the book. She's attending a boarding school in London. She's an only child, and she runs off to America with a British officer, a Lieutenant Montraville. And, of course, in it, the villainess is a French woman because, of course, it's the 1790s and it's England. And the French woman comes to New York as well. And Charlotte cannot live with her officer friend or lover in the barracks, of course, because they're not married. So he takes a place for her on a farm just north of New York City. And then the book gets very dramatic and very scandalous when Charlotte is abandoned by him when she is pregnant. And at the big height of the book, Charlotte Temple is pregnant. She's been thrown out of her house because she has no money. She's making her way down the Broadway in the mud and the pouring rain, and a kind-hearted woman takes her in. Now, this woman also has been done wrong by the villainous French woman. She takes in Charlotte Temple, writes to her family, and her father arrives in New York just as Charlotte Temple dies, giving birth to a baby girl that he then brings back to London with him. And in the book, Charlotte Temple is buried in Trinity graveyard. Now, some people said this is the true story of a young woman named Charlotte Stanley, who they believe was buried in Trinity graveyard, and the story of Susanna Rawson's cousin, John Montresor, an engineer who was based in New York. So, of course, the book was a big hit and a bestseller when it hit New York because of all the rumors that it was really about Captain John Montresor. So here's the grave of Charlotte Temple. Walking along the path, we come to the grave of Mr. William Bradford, who was the first English language printer in the colony of New York. He was born in 1660 and came to America in 1682. He first went to Philadelphia and then arrived in New York, where he was the printer for the government or the colonial government for over 50 years. And his grave says, "Printer to this government for upwards of 50 years, and being quite worn out with old age and labor, he left this mortal state in the lively hopes of a blessed immortality." And then there's a section on the grave I really like. It says, "Reader, reflect how soon you'll quit this stage. You'll find but few attain to such an age. Life's full of pain. Lo, here's a place of rest. Prepare to meet your God when you are blessed." And it also says, "Here also lies the body of Elizabeth, wife to the said William Bradford, who departed this life July 8th, 1781, aged 68 years. This is a restoration, or it could be a complete replica, I'm not sure which, of the original gravestone of William Bradford, the printer. Okay, are you ready? Now we're going to walk deep into the graveyard, and we're going to start running into the people I call the A-list of Trinity Church graveyard. And the first of those people we're going to see is Albert Gallatin. And if you don't already know, Albert Gallatin served as Treasury Secretary in the administrations of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Gallatin was originally Swiss and came to America and was appointed Treasury Secretary by Thomas Jefferson in 1801. So you might know that that means that Albert Gallatin was at the Treasury when we did the Louisiana Purchase. So he would have been doing the financial arrangements regarding the Louisiana Purchase, the buying of that great mass of land from Napoleon and the French. After that, the next president was James Madison. Madison kept Gallatin on and appointed him again as Treasury Secretary, where he worked for Madison in a number of ways financially, but he also was one of the diplomats who helped negotiate the end of the War of 1812. So this big brownstone vault you see here toward the back of the graveyard is Albert Gallatin, Treasury Secretary. Now, the next grave we're going to talk about is one where when the graveyard is open, and I'll note here that the graveyard has been closed since March of 2020 and is still closed, so I'm using for this video all old pictures that I've accumulated over time. Anyway, when the graveyard is open, it wouldn't be unusual to find a little crowd of people around our next grave. And the really neat part about that is that the person they're all there looking for is not someone who really, in the scope of time, was that important in New York or American history, but is incredibly famous now because of the Hamilton musical, and that would be Angelica Schuyler Church. So Mrs. Church is buried here in this vault with a number of other people. Now, the graveyard says, or the burial records say, that it is the believed to be burial place of Angelica Schuyler Church. So even here at Trinity, they're not 100% sure that she's in this vault. But what's interesting is that there is someone in this vault who is incredibly important, not only in New York history, but American history and world history, and that is Robert Fulton, who built the very first steamship. Now, you might remember that the name of that steamship was the Claremont, and it was named for his father-in-law, who is also buried in this vault, Chancellor Robert Livingston, a very important person in New York during the Revolutionary War and the founding person. He also swore in George Washington as president. His estate was named Claremont, and that first ship traveled from New York City to Claremont. So in this vault, we have Angelica Schuyler Church, Robert Fulton, and Chancellor Robert Livingston. And oh, by the way, did you know that Angelica's husband, John Barker Church, was also in a duel with Aaron Burr? And that duel took place a number of years before the much more infamous duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. Let's continue our walk. We're passing by some very old vaults and gravestones, so old we can no longer see the inscriptions or the engravings on them. We're going to take a skinny little path that goes behind the church, and it's on that path that we come to what I think is one of the most impressive graves in all of Trinity Church. And no, it's not Hamilton. I'm sorry if I disappoint you, but this is the grave of James Alexander and his son, William Alexander, Lord Stirling, also known as Major General Lord Stirling. Now, why do I think this grave is so impressive? Well, if you watch Mrs. Q, you know that Mrs. Q speaks often about James Alexander. James Alexander was a lawyer, and he was one of the lawyers involved in the case of John Peter Zenger, the newspaper printer who was put in prison for seditious libel. That case created the free press in the city of New York in 1735, which of course led to the First Amendment and the promise of a free press in our nation today. So that's the great lawyer James Alexander. James Alexander also taught a lawyer named William Livingston, who then taught a lawyer named John Jay, who was Livingston's son-in-law. And John Jay, you know, was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and a later governor of New York, among other great things that he achieved in his life. So in this grave is James Alexander. James Alexander's wife, Mary Alexander, was one of the greatest merchants in New York of her time, and sometimes as Mrs. Q, I speak of her as a mentor to young Mrs. Q when she was a young woman learning how to run her own business. So he's also the wife of Mary Alexander. Their son, William Alexander, petitioned the Parliament for them to regain their lands in Scotland, as they were the official heirs of the lands called Stirling in Scotland. You might remember when England conquered Scotland, many of the Scottish lands were taken away and given to English aristocrats instead. So young William Alexander petitioned the Parliament for many years to be reinstated as the rightful Earl of Stirling. The Parliament not only turned down his request, but ordered him to cease and desist using the title in America. At that time, the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia, in order to spite the Parliament, named William Alexander the Earl of Stirling. So William Alexander is the only person in American history to ever be given a title of aristocracy like this. And throughout the war, he served as a major general under Washington's command. He was loved by his men. He was incredibly important in the Battle of Long Island, or Battle of Brooklyn in 1776, and he was known throughout his days of command as Stirling, or Lord Stirling, or Major General Stirling. And he and his father and a number of other family members are buried here behind the church. Now, this is the old gravestone, and it's cracked and in really bad shape. I have heard that as part of the restoration of Trinity Church that has been going on for the last year and a half, or maybe 2 years now, that this grave has been restored. I have not been able to get access to the graveyard to check that out, but once I can get into the graveyard, it is one of the very first things I'll check: the grave of the Alexander family, James Alexander and his son William, Major General Lord Stirling. Emerging from the back path behind the church into the southern side of Trinity Graveyard, one of the first big graves we see here is the grave of John Lamb. John Lamb was a wine merchant. He was a founder and leader of the New York Sons of Liberty, and he was a general in the Revolutionary War. He was an artillery commander, General John Lamb. After the war, he returned to his wine merchant business and became a key politician in the city of New York. So the grave of General John Lamb. And there is no lack of Revolutionary War soldiers and officers on this side of the graveyard. The next one we come to is Franklin Wharton, Lieutenant Colonel of the United States Marine Corps. He also served as the third Commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps. And here also is a picture of a group of Marines celebrating his birthday a number of years ago. So way in the back corner, if you're facing Trinity Church, it's going to be on your left. In the very back left-hand corner, we find Franklin Wharton. If we go up the path a bit, we find the grave of Hugh Gaine, someone you've probably never heard of, but who was incredibly important in New York during the Revolutionary War period. Hugh Gaine was a bookseller, a printer, and a newspaper publisher. So everyone at the time knew Hugh Gaine and were familiar with his newspaper, the New York Mercury. During the Revolutionary War, he moved over to New Jersey, where he published a sort of pro-independence newspaper, but when he thought the British were going to win, he returned to New York City and published a pro-British paper for a while. He stayed on at the end of the Revolutionary War, but exited printing as apparently his newspapers were not that profitable. Many of them were not. But I do think I read that Hugh Gaine himself, though, was a very successful printer and book publisher and one of the wealthiest printers in New York City, the grave of printer Hugh Gaine. And if you've been on my Revolutionary War tour, you know the next grave. We may not have visited on the tour, but you know his story. This is the grave of James Mcevers, the stamp agent. When the Stamp Act was passed in 1765, stamp agents were appointed in all of the colonies. The agent's job was to oversee the implementation of the stamp tax to make sure that all of the stamp paper was distributed and the tax was collected and that everything went according to plan. James Mcevers, when everyone started turning against the stamp tax in New York and it got dangerous, resigned his position as the stamp agent, and at that time gave the governor some pretty good advice about not attempting to bring the stamped paper into New York. Well, Mcevers was the first stamp agent to resign. He was greeted at his home with 3 cheers by the men in the Committee of Correspondence, or Sons of Liberty, and his resignation was published throughout the colonies. As a result, every stamp agent did resign in 1765, leaving no one to officially receive the stamped paper. This is the great James Mcevers. I'd just like to stop here in front of this grave to let you know that this is not the grave of Robert Fulton. Robert Fulton is buried in the Chancellor Robert Livingston vault that we visited a short time ago on the other side of Trinity Church. This is a monument that was placed here in his honor by the Society of Mechanical Engineers. And it's a big monument. Everyone sees it. It's one of the largest on this side of the graveyard. And people always think Robert Fulton is buried here, but he is not. I assure you, he is in the Robert Livingston vault. But this is really a lovely monument on his behalf. Just a few steps away is yet another New Yorker who was long forgotten until the Hamilton musical, and that is Hercules Mulligan. And some of you know him from the musical as a tailor and a spy during the Revolutionary War. Hercules Mulligan was a very well-educated and successful businessman, and he lived to be about 80 years old. This is the vault he shares with his wife and their extended family. So this is the Wally and Mulligan Vault, final resting place of Hercules Mulligan. We're going to end our walk through the graveyard today at what I think is the most tragic grave site here at Trinity, and that is the grave site of Alexander Hamilton, his son Philip, and his wife Elizabeth Schuyler. As you know, Hamilton died in July 1804 in a duel with Vice President Aaron Burr. At the time of his death, Hamilton had little money and a lot of debt, and as a result, this grave site and monument were paid for by his fellow officers in the American Revolution, known as the Society of the Cincinnati. His son Philip, who died 3 years before him in a duel with George Eaker in 1801, and you might remember we stopped by George Eaker's grave at St. Paul's graveyard. Philip is buried nearby as well. In front of Hamilton's gravesite is a vault which holds the remains of his always loyal wife, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, who outlived him by 50 years. Mrs. Hamilton never remarried. She wore black all the years of her widowhood, continued to raise all of their remaining 7 children by herself, and asked to be reunited with him in death. And she rests here right next to him, the gravesite of Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. Now, as we leave the graveyard, this is by no means the full extent of the important and interesting graves that you can find here. They're just the ones that I thought you would find most interesting and that I put in this little walking tour for you. And as we leave, let's have a look at Trinity Church as it looked decorated last year for Christmas. Since Christmas isn't that far off and they're not decorated for Halloween. I wish you all a great and happy Halloween. I hope you enjoyed our walk through the graveyards. I am hoping Trinity will reopen and I can take you all through one day on a live and virtual tour. So let's hope that can happen for us one day. And if you liked this video, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe so that you'll find out when I'm posting more of these great little walking tours of New York City. Thanks again for watching, and I will be back soon. I think the next story I'm going to release is of the skyscraper wars in Lower Manhattan. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it.